Hi everyone, this is Catherine from Cinemetrics Technologies. We're going to begin our webinar today on Xeams best practices and new features. So we're going to be going over some tips and tools you should be using, things you should be avoiding, and at the end we'll have the Q&A. And right now I'm going to hand over the microphone to our lead tech. His name is Imran.
Thank you, Catherine. This is Imran. So thank you everybody for joining us today. There's a chat window available for you to post any questions during this seminar. We're going to try to answer those questions towards the end. So basically what I've done is there's a PDF document with some slides in it, and then I'm going to be switching back and forth between those slides and the and Xeams web interface. So I'll show you a few things in the web interface, and then we're going to be talking about the slides as well. So basically today's agenda is best practices in Xeams. We're going to be talking about what to do, what not to do. We're going to be talking about some of the newly added features, some usage tips, and then finally there's going to be a Q&A. So when it comes to best practices, one of the most important thing that we always recommend people when using Xeams for filtering emails is to make sure that your Xeams is being used not only for inbound but also for outbound, because a lot of people don't realize the benefits of filtering outbound emails. And it's very, very important that you let Xeams filter outbound emails as well. The reason is that Xeams learns from what goes out. So let's say when you send an email to somebody at gmail.com, and when that somebody replies back, Xeams knows that, hey, this is a reply to a message that went out to that person. So that outside person gets credit, and eventually the filtering is going to get much, much better. We have noticed that about 90% of the email messages that are sent between people are the same people communicating with each other. So when you use Xeams for outbound, it's going to learn and it's going to make it a lot better. There are other benefits besides that. For example, you could configure DKIM. I'm going to talk about DKIM later on in the presentation. You can do archiving, so you will have a history of what messages were sent. In fact, you can send alerts. Like for example, if you want certain documents that you think are very important and should not be going out to anybody, you can have alerts in Xeams that'll send email messages to the administrator if something like that happens. There are delivery status notifications. So I'm going to be talking about that delivery status a little bit more, because you can, using the logs in Xeams, you will know exactly if a message was delivered or if it wasn't delivered. This way, it's easy to track messages that are kind of lost and you don't know where exactly the problem occurred. So again, it's very, very important that you let Xeams filter outbound emails. Then there are some best practices for outbound emails. I'm going to be showing you the actual Xeams interface, but basically when you're sending outbound emails, you can use DKIM, DMARC, and SPF. All three of these, if you go to Google now, by the way, Google, in my opinion, is an excellent source of asking any questions regarding Xeams. So for example, if I want to ask Xeams, rather than going to Xeams.com, I'm going to ask Google. So Xeams SPF, let's say. It'll take you to the page that talks about SPF. Similarly, if I did Xeams followed by DMARC, it's going to take me to the page that talks about DMARC. So using SPF, DKIM, and DMARC are, oops, I messed up my slides. Okay, so using DKIM, DMARC, and SPF are very, very important when you are sending outbound emails. So Xeams automatically handles these specifications for inbound, so you don't have to do anything to filter inbound. But it is important that when you're sending messages out, these technologies are used, and it's very easy to do that in Xeams. You just simply go to filter management, and you know what, actually I am not in the right profile, so I don't have, let me connect back. Okay, so under filter management, you see this DKIM, DMARC, and SPF. So like I said, for inbound, it's automatically there. For outbound, you have to configure DKIM. So you go here, you basically specify your domain name. It's going to create, so let's say your domain name happens to be XYZ, okay? Now, make sure that XYZ is your domain, and then you put a selector, which is usually, you can put anything you want, but I'm just going to use it for today's date, okay? And then when you do that, it will create the public key for you, and you have to put this host name along with this public key in your DNS server. And once all that is done, this active column is going to turn yes. Now, obviously, I just use a garbage domain XYZ, and I don't have the DNS for this. I'm not authorized to modify that DNS, so I'll never be able to do this. But assuming that this was my domain, I would go in my DNS server and I would put this is my public key for DKIM, and I'll put that in my DNS server. Of course, if you run into any problems, contact our support and we'll try to help, we'll help you out configuring the DKIM for you. So going back here, I keep losing. Okay. Another thing that you want to do is start TLS. Recently, more and more companies have made it mandatory that you use encryption when sending out emails, particularly with the GDPR in Europe. A lot of companies are making sure that if it's not encrypted, they probably won't send you emails. And even in the US, I think, I'm sure Comcast is probably doing it. They ensure that the messages are being delivered, using Start TLS. So it's very important that you enable Start TLS. In order to enable Start TLS in Xeams, you basically have to do two things. First, you have to make sure that the secure web server is not 0. So in this case, I've set it up as secure web server as 5273. The second thing that you have to do is you go into the SMTP configuration and you have to enable this. Now, if you don't do anything but simply these two things, Xeams is going to download a self-signed certificate and will use that self-signed certificate for encryption. That obviously is not recommended. It is strongly recommended that you do purchase a certificate that is trusted by other servers on the internet, so that when your message goes out, it uses that trusted certificate. Now, if you use a self-signed certificate, it is really up to the sender or the receiver on the other end whether to trust or not to trust. So some may decide to trust it. Some may say, hey, you know what? How come your certificate is expired or it's not trusted? I don't want to send you an email. So it's important that you purchase a valid certificate from a certificate authority. So that's about Start TLS, and it talks about don't use self-signed certs, right? Another thing that you should do when sending outbound is this diagnostic check, which is right under this tools menu. You go here and you run the diagnostic check outbound. What it does is it actually contacts Cinemetrics server, and it tries to send an email out, and our server is going to check whether your hello is okay, whether your PTR record is there. So a lot of things that are usually checked by the receiving server, Cinemetrics server is going to check that, and it's going to warn you, hey, you know what, your hello is not correct. Or if you don't have a PTR record for your IP address where the messages are coming from, it's going to warn you, hey, how come your IP is 1, 2, 3, 4, and your PTR record points to something else. So it's going to warn you about that. So it's very important that you run those diagnostic checks on your outbound. So next, we're going to talk about inbound filtering. Again, in inbound filtering, you should run the diagnostic checks inbound. It's going to warn you if there are problems. It's going to warn you if something is an open relay or things like that. Okay, so it's important that you run the diagnostic checks. Second, it's actually a tip. We always recommend that you add a few body filters here. And these body filters should have something unique to your company. For example, having a zip code or a street address or a name of a product or something like that. Spammers definitely won't know what your zip code is. So if you see like a zip code or a street address, in any email, you should, Xeams should give credit for those things. So you should definitely consider doing that. Another tip is do not whitelist your own domain. We see this quite often. People mistakenly whitelist their own domain. And what that does is it allows forged emails to come through. Because when you whitelist something and somebody is forging the sender's email address, well, guess what? Xeams is going to let that go. Now, there's a big difference between whitelisting and trusted domains. So what I mean by that is, if I go here to, where's my whitelisting? Okay, here we go. No, this is the IP address. Whitelisting is in content filter and center filter, right? So if I go to the center filter and I add one of the domain names here to whitelist, that is quite different from a trusted domain. Trusted domains, you go to SPF and then you click Manage Trusted Domains and add those trusted domains. So for example, Amazon.com or Apple.com. In this particular example, Amazon and Apple are trusted. What that means is that if something comes from Apple, Xeams is going to look up, and it will do an SPF lookup on Apple.com and will only allow or only give credit if the message came from the right source. So if somebody's forging Apple or Amazon, it's not going to have any effect. Only messages that are coming from the right source and belong to Apple.com, that's trusted. So that's the difference between trusted domains and a whitelisted domain. Whitelisted domain, there's no checkup. Nothing gets done. If somebody whitelists their own domain, every message that's forged is going to come through, and it's going to be a problem. So that's the difference between those two. There's something called the optimization wizard, which is under filter management. And we recommend that you run this filter optimization wizard, about once a month. It's going to tell you if a user has created a rule that should not be created. Now, by the way, let me back up a little and talk about the user rules and global rules. There are two kinds of rules. If you're logged in as an admin and whatever changes you make, let's say you whitelist an address, that's global. So when you're logging into admin, you're affecting everybody. But when you log in as a user, any changes that you make to either whitelisting or blacklisting, it only affects one user. It does not affect every other user. So the filter optimization wizard will tell you if something is not right. So for example, if I run this, right now there's some missing SPF record. That's what it says. But there's nothing else wrong. But if there were something wrong, you would have seen it here. Okay, so it's a good idea to run this optimization wizard once a month. Okay, avoid aggressive scoring. What that means is that you don't want to assign scores that are either too high or too low, because Xeams is, it works with a cumulative score, right? It adds maybe 20 or 30 or 100, and then eventually gives you a score. often what happens is that people aggressively score, because let's say if they think, hey, spammer at XYZ is really a bad guy, what they do is they give a 5,000 score. Now, when you give a 5,000 score, there is, under score configuration, there is a parameter called deletion threshold, okay? Any message that is above 5,000 will get deleted so it's not gonna get quarantined, it's gonna get deleted, meaning there won't be any trace of that message. So you don't wanna give just one rule a high enough score that would take it beyond this deletion threshold, because then you lose pretty much every trace of the message. One exception to this rule is like a virus. So maybe if you think that there is somebody sending a virus, in that case, maybe you wanna, let it go beyond deletion threshold. And same thing works with the good messages. You don't wanna give something a very low negative score, because let's say if you give one particular person, let's say a negative 2,000, okay? That score is so low that no other rule will take effect. By the way, somebody's asking a question here on the chat. Hey, why my build is a little bit newer? It is newer because we're always working on new updates. So internally, we're using a slightly newer build than what is available to general public. So thanks, Tony, for asking that question. Okay, so again, coming back to my point, you don't want to assign a score that is very, very high, okay? Okay, after you change the scores, you should simulate the score. So let's say I'm gonna go to my view all junk, okay? And I see a message that came in, this guy here. And for whatever reason, I think, hey, you know what, maybe this is a good message, I wanna change it. I would probably go and add this guy in my whitelist or whatever. Once I add the whitelist, you should run the simulate so that it can give you another score. So hopefully if you add that person in whitelist, this won't be 533 anymore. It's probably gonna be somewhere in the negative or below 100. Okay, so it's considered good. Okay, so that's okay. Another very, very important thing that you have to keep in mind when filtering inbound is that your firewall that is sitting in front of your Xeams does not mask the sender's IP address. Often we run into situations where people are either running a firewall that's masking, or maybe they're running it inside a Docker, or something that is preventing. So in this example, in this picture, the sender's IP address is 200, 201, 202, and 2. But for whatever reason, by the time the message comes to Xeams, the firewall is actually acting as a proxy. And what it does is it changes the IP address in the header, in the TCP IP header. And by the time Xeams gets it, the IP address is no longer 200, 201, 202, but it's 192.168.1.1. And when that happens, you lose about 60% of the filtering capabilities, because a lot of things are associated with the IP address. Xeams will check whether the IP is in an RPL server, whether the PTR record's there. So a lot of tests happen on the IP address. So it is very, very important that you make sure that the IP addresses are not identical. The easiest way to check that is you go to view logs. In the view logs, you go to SMTP conversation. Now, this is assuming you're using the regular SMTP server. If you are using the proxy server, then you would select the SMTP proxy conversation. In this particular example, I'm just using the SMTP conversation. So here, if I search for new, connections, okay, and I show content, I see here all of these IP addresses are different. If these IP addresses are all identical, there's a problem. You don't want that to happen. because emails should come from all over, not just one IP. And if this is the case, meaning your firewall is masking the IP, then the filtering is not going to work really nicely. So it's very important that you make sure that whether it's the firewall, or maybe you're running inside a Docker, or you're running inside a virtual machine, and the network isn't set up correctly, in that case, you will only get one IP, and Xeams will think that everything is coming from that one IP. Besides filtering, Xeams has alerts. So for example, if somebody's trying to, guess passwords, and if everything appears to come from one IP, guess what? Everybody's going to get blocked, because Xeams thinks that, hey, somebody's trying to guess passwords from that IP, and it's going to get blocked. So it's very important that you don't do that. Another tip is about message size, which is right here. So there are two settings here. This is the global size, and this is the actionable size. Global size tells Xeams what is the biggest email that you'll accept. Okay, so in this particular case, this is in bytes. So this is, I'm just going to put a comma here so that you can see. So this is about 20 megs. Okay. If you want to increase that, that's fine. So I'm just going to put another 0 here. So that becomes 200 megs. Okay. So this means that Xeams will accept up to 200 meg of attachments. This number here, it tells Xeams if the message is over 4 meg in this case, don't filter it, because filtering requires a lot of resources. When an email comes in, Xeams makes multiple copies of that email in different formats so that filtering can occur. So a 4 megabyte file can easily become at least 5 times. So 4 times 5 is 20 megs, okay? So it's gonna take 20 megabytes of memory inside Xeams. And viruses or spam are usually never that big. Imagine if a spammer wanted to send 1 million messages and each message was 1 megabyte. That would translate into 1 terabyte of network traffic. So it's very, very rare to see a spam message that is larger than 3 or 4 megs, okay? So we always recommend leave this number either 4 meg or 3 meg, and then select in the action column, do not filter. So if a message is over 4 megs, just let it go, assume that it's good, okay? Now, there's another thing in Xeams, and that is this send large emails. And this is actually integrated with another product that we have. It's called Cinnamon. And that allows you to handle large emails. Okay, I don't want to talk about Cinnamon too much, but just keep an eye on these numbers here. Now, note that if I put this as 200 megs, there's no guarantee that you're going to get an attachment with 200 megs, because emails typically go through multiple SMTP servers, and whichever server has the lowest value for this is going to dictate the size of the message. So if the message goes through 3 SMTP servers and your setting is 200 meg, but let's say the second server is only 50 meg, you're not going to get a message. You're not going to get a message that is over 50 megs. Okay. All right. So I keep losing my PDF document here. Hold on. Sorry about that. Okay. So now let's talk about some of the recently added features. So in the latest update, we added something called SynRBL, which is actually our own RBL server. And you can check, again, I'm going to go to Google and search for Xeams SynRBL. Okay. And Google will give you the link for SynRBL. You can read through this, how it works. Basically, we collect data from your Xeams, and you can read this article, exactly what is being sent, how much data comes to our servers. We only collect IP addresses of the spammers. and they come to our RBL server, and then our RBL server does, blacklisting and all that. Okay, so that's in RBL. Another thing that you should do is look at this change log. So again, go to Google and Xeams change log, right? And Google will give you most likely the first one. And you can read this. It'll give you a very detailed, change log. For example, we added this friendly IP addresses in the last update, which prevents people from getting blocked incorrectly. Because if you go here, if you go to the alert section in Xeams, there are different alerts here. One of the alerts is a password alert. If somebody's trying to guess passwords, and if they do that more than like 5 times in this case, Xeams is going to block that. Okay, by putting a friendly IP addresses, you can avoid certain IP addresses from getting blocked, because you know that those IP addresses belong to one of your users, and they are probably just putting the wrong value for the password. So check this change log. A lot of things you will see here that we constantly add new features. Okay, so it's very helpful. Okay, additional status icons were added. So status icons are very neat in telling you what messages. So for example, I'm just looking at the junk folder here. When I look at a message, this little glasses becomes enabled, okay, and the tip says viewed, whereas if I click here, it says I haven't viewed this. So let's say if I view this message here, right, and I go back to my junk, now this is viewed. Okay, there's another little icon which is great, and it says, hey, this message was received without encryption. Let's see. Well, you know what, this is all junk, so all the junk is most likely on, particularly on this one, because I'm using a self-signed certificate. Okay, so a lot of companies probably won't. Actually, what I'm going to switch to profiles, because the profiles, this is a much better profile here. Let's see. Still don't see any junk messages that are using encryption. Okay, but if I guess go to good messages, I'll probably see. So in this particular case, encryption was used, so I see this in green, whereas this one is still gray. This little icon here, again, this could have either a green or a brown color. Green means that it was delivered. So this one is for incoming. Xeams received the message with encryption. This one is it was delivered to the next hop using encryption. Okay, if this was brown, it was delivered but not encryption. Again, you can go to Google and status icons, okay, and it'll show you the page that talks about the status icons. This, you will see exactly what each icon means here. All right. Okay, so another feature that was recently added, Active Directory now works with SSL. In order for SSL to work, all you got to do is put the port. So by default, I think the LDAP port is 389, and you put :6. I forget the exact port number, but I think it's 663 or something like that, the SSL port. So that's all you do. Just put that port and it should work. Inherited profiles. This is very important. And if you are not familiar with what inherited profiles are, again, go to Google and Xeams inherited profiles. So it'll talk about what inherited profiles are and what is the difference between inherited and independent. Okay, so prior to, I forget exactly, maybe a few versions ago, we only had independent profiles. And if you go here, if you go to switch profiles right now, there are actually, I have 3 profiles here. This one is inherited. This one's not inherited. And since this one's not inherited, I see this link here that says, hey, convert to inherited. And inherited profiles are much better than the independent profiles. Read this page on our website that talks about the benefits of having inherited profiles, because you're going to save not only runtime memory, but from an administrative perspective, it's a lot better. Okay, so some usage tips about security. One very important thing that you should do is you should disable the SMTP authentication on your primary SMTP port. By that, what I mean is, if I go here to SMTP configuration, my primary port is obviously 25, and SMTP authentication is allowed, okay? Now, what this says is, okay, send me a user ID and password on SMTP. Now watch, I'm gonna go to Tools and View Logs, and there's a log here that says invalid password attempts, okay? And I'm only gonna display, let's say, the last 20 lines. If you see here, see right now it's about 12, 20, 32 here in New Jersey. You can see all these guys trying to guess passwords, okay? Now, all these are garbage. There is no user account name service or root or whatever this is, right? But people are trying to guess passwords. And we have had, you know, support calls, a lot of support calls sometimes, because people, they, you know, somehow somebody finds a valid user ID and passwords on the internet, and then they are just misusing it. They can, you know, put that user ID password and then send their junk through your server, and creates big problems, because then your IP gets blacklisted and, you know, a lot of things, right? So it's important that you, if you don't need SMTP authentication on your primary, just uncheck this and usually pick up a different port number. Often people use 587. You could use 587. But if you have an option of using a non-standard port, and you can tell your clients, hey, you know what, if you want to send outbound emails, please use this port. This way, nobody knows that port outside your company. And SMTP authentication will only be allowed on this port. Most of the attacks that happen on the internet, they happen on port 25 and not on another port, because this port also requires start TLS. So a lot of these programs that people have written, they don't do all those checks, okay? So it's better to use a non-standard port and then let authentication, let authentication only allow on this one and not on this one. So watch, I'm gonna save this. And after this is saved, my log is gonna get a lot cleaner. So if I were to check the same log, let's say after 5 hours, I wouldn't see any additional entries in there, because authentication is just not allowed. So if somebody is trying to connect, so if I'm going to show you the log again here, the SMTP conversation.log, okay? In this one, if you see here, so this particular, okay? You see this auth plane, this won't be there anymore when authentication is disabled. And when that's not there, nobody will be able to even send. So if you see this one, this is a second example after. So this email came in after I changed that value, and you don't even see auth being advertised here, okay? So the door doesn't exist for somebody to come in. So, you know, nobody's gonna do anything. So it's a lot better. Okay, check the invalid password attempts.log, okay? So it's, one of the very, very good thing in Xeams are these log files. They give you a lot of information, okay? This particular log is very important. And so, you know, check this log once in a while to see what people are doing to your Xeams. Because if somebody's trying to either connect from the web server or the SMTP server or the IMAP or POP, all four of these servers, okay? You will know it's gonna log an invalid attempt. So you will know if somebody's trying to do something to your server. Okay. Again, configuring alerts. I think I already went to that screen, but I'll show you what those alerts are. So you go to manage alerts and, you know, configure these alerts. There's a web page for outbound forgery alert. So you'll know if somebody is forging your emails. Often that happens when there's a misconfiguration, because a lot of times what people do is, let's say your domain is xyz.com and there's a user, John at xyz.com, and John decides to forward any message coming in into your Xeams to, let's say, john at gmail.com. Now, that creates an indirect forgery, meaning, let's say the original email came from Hotmail, Mary at hotmail.com, and the recipient was John at xyz.com. John decides to forward that message to Gmail. Now the message that originally came from Hotmail appears to go out from your server with Hotmail as a sender. And that creates a forgery problem, because when Gmail gets it, Gmail is going to say, hey, how come Hotmail is sending an email from your IP address? Okay, so check, again, go to Google and Xeams outbound forgery, okay? And it's going to give you that page. Okay. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right, these are some miscellaneous tips using a preferred URL. So if you go here under server configuration, there is a field here that says preferred URL. You should use a value for preferred URL, because when you create users, or whenever Xeams needs to generate an email either sent to the administrator or an end user with a link to click. So for example, in the quarantine report, you could have, every quarantine report has a link, right, where the user can either whitelist or restore or do any of that. It gets that value from this preferred URL. So it's important that you specify a value for the preferred URL. Create users in Xeams. Even though it's not required, particularly when you're running Xeams in firewall mode or hybrid mode, you're not required to create users, but you should create users, because when you create users, a lot of things will happen. For example, they can get quarantine reports. So every user is going to get a report at the end of the day, letting them know what was blocked in their account, right? And then they can manage those messages. They can manage their own blacklist and whitelist. Again, those are at user level, meaning if somebody whitelists somebody, it only affects that one user, not everybody else. Whereas if administrator does it, it's going to affect everybody. Okay. Users can have out of office notifications built into Xeams. So there are a lot of benefits of having users in Xeams. Okay, do not specify a DNS server in Xeams. So what I'm talking about here is this. If you go here, this DNS server, this value should be blank. When this is blank, Xeams is going to use the DNS server that is provided at the machine level. And that DNS server is much better because there's a cache involved. Every DNS server has a cache, right? In fact, we have a KB article that talks about the importance of DNS server. Okay, importance of DNS server in Xeams. Read this article. It's going to talk about why the DNS is very, very important. Because not only DNS is used for figuring out what the MX record is for outbound emails, but more importantly, DNS is used for SPF lookups, for RBL lookups. Okay, so it's very important that you have the right DNS server. And when this value is blank, your machine DNS is going to get used. And the machine DNS, the DNS server that you've configured for a machine, should not be a local DNS. We recommend that you use a DNS server that belongs to your ISP, because the ISP's DNS server will probably have a bigger cache than a DNS server that's, let's say, on your primary domain controller. So it's always better to use an ISP rather than yours, okay? And use the machine DNS because it has a much better cache. Okay, there's something called a spam learner address. So if you go to, I believe, advanced. Okay, the spam learner address. what this is, again, you can go to Google and Xeams Spam Learner, and you're going to get to that page. But basically, the Spam Learner is a way for your users to forward messages that were incorrectly. So let's say if somebody gets a spam message all the way to the inbox, rather than your users contacting you and telling, hey, you know what, how come I got this junk message in my inbox? Users can send that email, forward that email to the Spam Learner address. And Xeams is going to learn from that message, okay? So check the Spam Learner. Okay, how to set it up, and so that when your user sends a message, Xeams will learn from it. Okay, so that's a good thing to do. Okay, promote temporary emails. There's a neat feature in Xeams that creates temporary emails. Okay, go here. It talks about what it is. Basically, any email address or any user, let's say there's a user called John Doe at yourcompany.com. That user can put a plus sign followed by anything. So let's say if they're shopping with Walmart, they could put John Doe plus Walmart at yourcompany.com. And this way, if Walmart leaks your user, your email address, you will know that it's Walmart that leaked it. Okay. Another thing that you could do is put an expiration on it. So you can put John Doe plus Walmart plus an expiration date. So that email will not work after it has expired. So in this case, well, this example is already expired. This is 2016. But let's say if you put 2018 12/31. So if a user needs to give an email address to somebody on the internet and they think that you won't need that address after a certain date, you could put an expiration right in the email address. So if that person sends you an email at that address after that date, Xeams will just say, hey, there's no such user. But before this date, it's going to accept it, okay? Another little tip that I haven't put in my slides here is the use of this program called Email Sender that you can download from our website. Okay, for some reason let me make this a little bit bigger. So this Email Sender program, you can use this Email Sender program to test emails to either Xeams or any SMTP server. And the good part is it shows you the logs. So if there's a problem, delivering messages, this tool is very, very handy. So that's pretty much it as far as the presentation goes. So I can answer any questions. So far, only Tony asked a question about the version, and we're just using a slightly newer version than what's available publicly. But does anybody else have a question? No questions? Okay, I see one. Are there any plans to make Xeams multilingual? This is in our to-do list for a very long time. Unfortunately, it's not very, very simple to do this, because in order to, so Xeams is multilingual when it comes to receiving emails, right? I mean, if I go here, I'll see, in my junk, I'll see Chinese, which is probably the most common language. Here we go. I see something in Chinese, okay? But the interface itself is currently only in English. And in order for us to convert that into multiple languages, it's a huge, huge task. But it is in our to-do list, and hopefully one day we'll have in different languages. But at least right now, the web interface is only available in English. Okay, so there's a question. Are any plans in putting a backup mechanism in with the prog? Okay, when you say about backup, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this clustering. Clustering, so right now this is not clustered, but clustered is actually a backup. Well, not backup, but you could have high availability, okay? So if you go to Xeams clustering, it talks about how clustering works, okay? So if your goal is to make it, highly available, then you can use clustering. Now, when it comes to the actual backing up Xeams, Xeams doesn't back up, there's no backup inside Xeams, but what it does is the config folder, which is the most important folder in Xeams, and you can go to that config folder. Let me see if I can connect to this particular server that I'm connected to. Just give me one moment. Let me see if I could show you the disk for this. Okay, I am. So this is the machine where that test server is running, right? This is the config folder on that. And this config folder is the most important folder that contains pretty much every configuration that you can think of. Xeams automatically backs up this folder into this archives subfolder, and there is one file per day. So you're going to have 7 copies of the configuration, previous 7 days. So if something goes wrong, you can always go back and extract the files. So basically, if I were to open this, this is basically exactly the files that you see in this folder. So that's the only backup that's built into Xeams. So if your question was regarding backup, this is the only thing. We actually have a backup software. If you want to check that out, just type Syncrify in Google, and you can go there. We have a different for backup, okay? But if your goal was to provide like a highly available solution, then what you're looking for is clustering, okay? All right, is any disadvantage of putting this on the same server that's running your Exchange server? So the question is there a disadvantage of running Exchange and Xeams on the same machine? The only disadvantage is the resources. Exchange usually requires a lot of resources. So you can certainly do it if you are running, if you don't have computers, then of course you can do it. But a cleaner solution is to have Xeams running on a different computer than Exchange. This way, if let's say Xeams goes down, your Exchange is still up. Plus, you can do something like this that you cannot do without if Xeams is on the same one, right? Because you could have clustered. So if let's say this is your Exchange, this is one of your Xeams, you could have additional Xeams all connecting to Exchange. And if either Exchange goes down or Xeams goes down, let's say the hardware fails, the other machines will hold the messages, okay? Whereas if Xeams and Exchange are on the same machine, and if the hard drive dies, there will be a downtime. Okay, so other than that, there's no disadvantage. All right, any possibility of making the program more than an email server replacement for Exchange server to include calendar? All right, so right now, the calendaring and contact is not there. And to tell the truth, not a lot of people are asking for that. But of course, if we see, people asking for it, we'll definitely consider. So right now, we're not treating Xeams as a competing solution to Exchange or Zimbra. Zimbra and Exchange are very, very good in terms of collaboration. Xeams does not have those features. So we don't tell people, hey, you know what, get rid of your Exchange or get rid of your Zimbra and just switch to Xeams, okay? Xeams does an excellent job of filtering. But of course, it does not have all the, the collaboration features. But again, it's possible that we may do it in the future, but at least right now, we don't see a lot of demand for that because Exchange has done a fantastic job of that, and Zimbra, and I'm sure there are others that do that. Xeams is very, very good in filtering. So right now our focus is on that part, but again, that doesn't mean that we will never do that. All right, thanks. I never knew that. That's great. I've been created a script from copy files. So okay. So this is probably just a comment, not a question. Okay. Any other question? Any plans of making it easier to modify user reports? Okay. So could you? I think Daniel asked this question again. Could you clarify what do you mean by easier to modify? There's one. So if I go back here to my to here in the config folder, there is a template that Xeams used to generate the reports. Okay, let me see where that template is. I think it's this one here. Let me see if it's this one. Yeah. So this is an HTML template, which is the status email. Is it this one, or maybe there's another one? No, I'm sorry. It's this one. Email notification. Okay, I'm going to move this one here. So this is a template that Xeams uses to generate the quarantine report. Feel free to modify this. Let's say if you want to change the language from English to French, this is where you would do it. So when your user gets the email, they will get the quarantine report, in French. Okay, so any plans to make it easier to modify? Yeah, right now you can modify the template directly. That's it. Yeah, so that is the only method right now. Can you recommend, do me a favor, Daniel. Send us an email with what you want, or maybe a mock-up report or something like that, and we'll definitely consider it. Okay. Most of the new features that you see in Xeams, it's you guys who tell us, hey, I want this or I want that. Okay. So if you think that we can make the quarantine report better, please send us an email with a sample report and we'll definitely consider it. Okay. All right. How can I block email addresses to someone not listed in the user? Connecting to an Active Directory is not an option. Okay, so that's a good question. So you don't want to connect to Active Directory, but still you want to reject invalid users. Okay, so in Xeams, there are two kinds of users. There are one that come from Active Directory and others that are local to Xeams. So when you're not connecting to an Active Directory, the only choice you have is to create users within Xeams. There are multiple ways of creating users. For example, you could import users from a CSV file. You could have users themselves create an account for them, and a lot of things. If you go to, again, Google and search for Xeams create users, you will get the page that talks about how to create users and what kind of users there are. Okay, so assuming that you have local users, all you got to do is you go to the SMTP configuration under relaying, and you check this box that says reject emails for invalid users. Okay, so if you have local users and if you have that checked, Xeams won't accept any user that is not among the local user. Another thing that you could do is called a DRV, which is right here, dynamic recipient verification. With DRV, what you could do is have another server. So let's assume that you do have an Exchange, but for whatever reason you don't want to use Active Directory. Okay, you could configure Xeams so it'll contact your Exchange server before accepting any email. And that's what DRV is. So instead of contacting Active Directory, it is going to contact another SMTP server. And if the user exists in that SMTP server, then and only then Xeams will allow that. So 3 different mechanisms: Active Directory, DRV, and then local users. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, there's a problem. I cannot modify the subject of the email or the sender. I'm assuming you are, so this is Daniel again. I think this is related to quarantine report. And there's a okay, so you want to change the subject of the message. You know what? Send us an email. I'm sure there's a way to change the subject. I just don't remember right now on top of my head. So there is a way to change the subject of the quarantine report, okay? I just have to do some more research. So please send us an email and we'll send you the instructions on how to do that. Okay. There's a comment that says, need to run MTG. Very informative. Look forward. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so you need to run MTG. Could you give us an example of what would you like to see? As far as I know, MTG is used for, now I could be wrong in understanding what you mean by MTG. I think there's this program that tells you, oh, meeting. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, John. Oh, sure. Go ahead. I misunderstood your question. Okay, all right, so I'm gonna go, I will do that, thanks, okay, so I don't see any more questions. Anybody else with questions? You know, we will try, we have recorded the presentation, so hopefully if nothing went wrong in that recording, we will make it available for download, yes. Any more questions? I guess not. So we'll call this done. It is, well, it's almost, an hour. So that's good. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for your comments, and please feel free to send us emails if you have any suggestions on what features you would like to see. Feel free to send us email, and we'll definitely incorporate those features. All right, everybody. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Bye.